behavioral instructions during your tempestuous storm. Last week, we talked about the indestructibility of God's servant and getting through the storms. Today, I want to talk with you about how to live in the midst of the storms. My message is a sequel today of last week's sermon. And as a preface to today's message, I want to give you an instant, very brief playback of my sermon of last Sunday. You remember Rusty Falwell sang so beautifully, "Till the storm passes by," and then I talked about the indestructibility of God's servant. I said that God's man is indestructible until he has finished the work God's called him to do. God's woman is indestructible until she has finished the work God has called her to do. And I quoted a very special verse for troubled saints whose hearts are fearful and frightened in the midst of their storms. Those were Paul's words, 2 Timothy 1:7, when he wrote to the young protege, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." And I went on to read the very lengthy text in Acts 27, where Luke describes Paul's horrendous experience aboard a ship that was taking him in chains as a prisoner to Rome, where he should appeal his case before Caesar. He was charged with the terrible behavior of preaching the gospel of Christ. And the first two verses of that Acts 27 text are verses 13-14. When the south wind blew softly. It was a very good day. Things were going well. Things were under control. It was a very good day. The south winds blew softly. Supposing they had obtained their purpose, supposing everything was under control, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind, an awful storm called Euroclydon. And the awful storms have a tendency of breaking out suddenly. I went on to explain that storms are to be expected. Nobody's smart enough, rich enough, powerful enough to avoid the storms. And I said storms are to be endured. Nobody is supposed to fail the test of the storms. God's enabling is adequate. And that storms are always ended. And I told you of Dr. E.V. Hill's favorite verse, "And it came to pass," he said, "it didn't come to stay." And I concluded that sermon last week by giving you three things to remember when the storms are raging, when the tempestuous storms are upon you. One, remember his presence. He said, "I'm with you all the way, even to the end of the age." And to remember who you are. You're a child of God. You're a joint heir with Jesus Christ. You belong to him. And remember what God said. 1 Corinthians 10:13, Paul said, "There hath no tempestuous storm taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer or allow you to be tempted above what you're able to bear, but will with every testing, every trial, every tempestuous storm enable you so that you'll be able to sustain it." And I told you last week how to survive the storms and come out victoriously on the other end. Today, I want to give you a roadmap to follow during your tempestuous storms. Some of you, in such a crowd as this, are in a terrible storm right now. Your Euroclydon is upon you. It could be, I think of little Lori McCauley I just mentioned. She and Greg, her husband, came down to me. I was in the stands a couple of months ago watching our last basketball game. And they walked over to me and said, "We want to tell you something." And while the crowd was cheering for the ball game, they whispered into my ears that Lori had liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, terrible cancer. She didn't look like it. They'd just been hit by that bombshell that very day. And that can happen to any of us. God, the south winds are blowing softly, and suddenly God can and we don't understand this, can lead us right into a Euroclydon, where there is no answer but the Lord. And the question is, how shall I behave during my storms? How differently do Christians behave and conduct themselves in comparison to unbelievers in the time of crisis? I preach lots of funerals. I think I preach thousands of them. And I can tell when I'm preaching the funeral of an unsaved person and an unsaved family, their behavior, their out of control temperament, the weeping, the wailing, the hopelessness, it's all clear. And there's not very much I can say but share the gospel with them and promise them my prayers. Because the fact is that once you breathe your last breath, it's too late. And I preach the funerals of saints. And while their tears, even Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died. While their tears, saints sorrow not as others who have no hope. There's a different kind of sorrow. The radical Islamic terrorists are taught that it's a great honor to Allah if they suffer greatly. And they're even taught that if they die in their conflicts and storms while killing the infidels, translated Christians and Jews, they'll be provided 72 virgins when they arrive in heaven. There was a rumor circulating in Washington some time ago that Osama bin Laden had been killed in one of the Pakistan caves there, and that he went to heaven. And as the story goes, when he arrived in paradise, Osama was greeted by George Washington, who slapped him right across the face and said, "How dare you attack the nation I helped build?" And Patrick Henry then punched him in the nose and shouted, "You wanted to end America's liberty, but you failed." And then James Madison appeared and kicked him and said, "This is why I ordered the government to provide for the common defense." Bin Laden was subjected to similar beatings from James Randolph and James Monroe and Thomas Jefferson and 66 other early Americans. And as he was lying on the ground, writhing in pain, an angel appeared. And he looked up with contempt at the angel and said, "This is not what I was promised." To which the angel replied, "I told you there were to be 72 Virginians to greet you. What did you think I said?" Which reminds me of another story from Washington last week, reporting that Chelsea Clinton had interviewed some Marines just returning from Iraq. And she asked one Marine, what do you fear most? He thought for a few moments and said, "Osama, Obama, and your mama." And now, back to the subject. How shall I behave? How shall I behave in the midst of my storms? I recently reread Bob Moeller's book on survival tactics for the Christian. And I found several excellent roadmaps there, and I incorporated my own experiences of 55 plus years in the faith with the following instructions regarding how to go down the right roads and to behave properly in the midst of your tempestuous storms. First of all, I've learned that I must remain focused on my calling. I must be focused. I'm a husband and a father and a grandfather. That's my calling. And I must focus on my wife and my children and my grandchildren. I mustn't be focused on myself or the storms. And I'm a pastor. You may be a businessman or woman, or an educator, or a professional person of some kind. And God's called you to that. You may be in the Lord's work, like our pastors and laborers here. But God's servant must be focused on the goal line, accepting nothing but victory in the midst of his tempestuous storms. He must be willing to pay any price and to suffer any hurt and hardship and refuse to be discouraged or disheartened. 1 Corinthians 16:9, Paul said, "For a great door and effectual is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries." We must stay focused on the open doors, not on the adversaries. We don't need to be telling God how big our mountains are. We need to be telling our mountains how big our God is. We must stay focused. We must stay focused on our calling. In the midst of tempestuous storms, I must reject discouragement. Discouragement is sin. Faith is believing God no matter what the circumstances dictate. Discouragement is believing the circumstances in spite of what God has promised. Your true greatness in life is not determined by your talent or wealth as the world measures greatness, but rather by what it takes to discourage you, to make you quit. Dwight L. Moody said, "I have never known God to use a discouraged person." In the midst of my tempestuous storms, no matter how hopeless my plight is, humanly speaking, I must be focused constantly on my calling, and I must reject discouragement. And I must remember that we're continually, all of us, we're continually faced by glorious opportunities, brilliantly disguised as insoluble problems. God can use the darkest days and the most impossible obstacles to bring us to where he could never have brought us otherwise. God knows what's best for us. And in the midst of my storms, I must not make major life decisions. I must not make major life decisions in the midst of my crises. Why? Because when we're caught up in the storm and our adrenaline is flowing high and our emotions are tender and sensitive, and the pressure is making us think in frantic ways, we seldom make good life decisions. We're better off to wait till the waves are down. Take the time until you're at perfect peace with God, and until you are able to say honestly, "Lord, thy will be done," and then begin making the decision. Don't make them in the height of your crisis. And in the midst of my storms, your storms, we must not seclude ourselves from family and friends. I thank God for a wife of, in our 50th year now, and for the comfort that she is and the encouragement. She's always been my best teacher, my best critic, my best helper. And I thank God for 3 children who bless my life every day. I didn't know Jonathan spoke for the Lynchburg Mayor's Day of Prayer here in the city until somebody told me in the back room this morning. Said Jonathan was great. I said, "Doing what?" Said he spoke for the National Day of Prayer. I said, "Well, the dude didn't tell me. I didn't know anything about it." And he doesn't tell me those things. He says, "When I walk in the room, I use up all the oxygen." Whatever that means. But I thank God for my children. They give me great advice. Jonathan's my pastor, and Jerry is my lawyer and business leader, and Jeannie, the surgeon, is my doctor. And she calls me at nights, and she'll get Maisel to put me on the other line and have Maisel listening, so if I agree to something, I'll do it. And then she gives me my instructions on how to live another 15 years. And I thank the Lord for the support of my family. And then I got these 8 brats. They said, "No, we're not brats, we're urchins." My 8 grandchildren that I have the privilege of sleeping with and eating with, and after the junior senior LCA event last, I think it was Friday night, wasn't it? Friday night, Becky had told us, "Now don't y'all go to the junior senior, you'll embarrass Trey. He's a senior this year. This is his night." I said, "Okay, we won't go." No sooner do we get home about 10 o'clock, and here comes the front door open, and here comes Trey and his girlfriend, 2 of his buddies, and their girlfriends, and they get out of their formals and get out of their informals to go bowling, and so forth, and I'm glad they feel the liberty, without permission, just walk in, take over the joint. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. In midst of crises, we need to take advantage of the support and the encouragement that our loved ones and friends can give to us. And something else I would urge you. Find a confidant. Find what I call a prayer buddy. Somebody who would never betray you, that you can say things to and share burdens with, who will become your prayer partner, who in 100 years would never mention what you ask prayer for to anyone else. Find a prayer partner. And then don't listen to your fears. Don't listen to the critics and don't believe the headlines in the paper and the evening news. Dread distorts your view of reality and God's ability to intervene and do the impossible. I've been discouraged through the years hundreds of times by people who tried to tell me it can't be done. And I remember some ordeals I won't mention. Good people said, well, Jerry, I wouldn't try that. Let me tell you why. It won't work here and so forth. But then God would just make it clear to me that he wanted me to do it. And the circumstances would be bitter and the money wouldn't be there and but I just felt God wanted me to do it. And so I didn't listen to the fears. And I didn't have reality distorted. And then God intervened. And so don't listen to your fears. And never give in to self-pity. Once you start, it's difficult to stop it and to recover a sense of thankfulness for all the positive things God's doing in your behalf. And don't live with regrets and second guesses. How many times have I heard somebody say, if I hadn't driven across town, I wouldn't have had that wreck, and I wouldn't have had this happen. Or if I hadn't gone here, I would have been where I should have been. Ifs and might have beens are ridiculous. There's no way that you can live with regrets and second guessing. They don't change the past, but you can change the future by prayer and trusting God. So forget all that. Don't live in regrets. And things happen in your life that you can think of a dozen ways it would have been averted or avoided if you hadn't done this or that. None of us have good hindsight. We can look back and we can see what we should have done, but you can't change it. And then I must not overlook the good things that happen to me daily. One of my favorite hymns is